Welcome to Chapter 17.2, Enlightenment Ideas Spread. Enlightenment ideas flowed from France across Europe and beyond. Before the Enlightenment, most Europeans had accepted that society was based on divine right of rule, which is a strict class system and a belief in a heavenly reward for earthly suffering. The ideas of the Enlightenment, found in books such as Diderot's Encyclopedia, changed those traditional beliefs and customs. In response, most government and church authorities waged war on things that were written. This is called censorship. They banned and burned books and imprisoned writers, and censorship did not stop the spread of these ideas. Philosophers and others disguised their ideas in works of fiction. Ideas continued to spread in salons, where people gathered to discuss new concepts in literature, the arts and the sciences, and also in philosophy. In the 1600s and 1700s, the art evolved to meet changing tastes and to reflect new Enlightenment ideas. The visual art and in music, there was a transformation from the heavier splendor of the Baroque style to a more light and charming style called the Rococo style. The ballets and operas and plays were performed at royal courts, and opera houses sprang up in Europe. Composers later created elegant works in a style known as classical. A growing audience of middle-class readers also led to a rise in new types of literature, a prose form called the novel, and Daniel Defoe wrote several interesting books, including Robinson Crusoe. The courts of Europe were also affected by the Enlightenment, as philosophers tried to persuade European rulers to make reforms. A few European monarchs did accept Enlightenment ideas, but they retained their absolute control. These enlightened despots used their power to bring about some political and social changes in Prussia and Russia. In Prussia, Frederick the Great kept a tight control over his subjects, but he did allow free press and religious toleration. In Russia, Catherine the Great abolished torture and criticized the institution of serfdom. In Austria, Joseph II traveled in disguise among his subjects and to learn of their problems. But despite the spread of Enlightenment ideas, the lives of most of the regular Europeans changed very slowly. The Enlightenment brought cultural changes as writers, artists, and musicians began to spread new ideas. Even the absolute rulers of Europe began using enlightened ideas, and they became known as enlightened despots, and they granted greater freedoms in their realms. From France, the heart of the Enlightenment, ideas spread across Europe and beyond. These new ideas created challenges to the rulers of the day. More people came to believe that reform was necessary to achieve something called just society. A just society. And even today we have the same idea that society needs to be have more justice. Most governments and church authorities felt that they had a sacred duty to defend the old order, which was the divine right to rule and strict social hierarchy. The most common defense of these two, the way that they defended against the new changes was through censorship, which means that they regulated the books and the writers. And of course the writers fought back. They used disguise for their ideas. They disguised them in fiction. So there are three notable writers of the Enlightenment. The first one would be Voltaire. He wrote a book called Candide, which was a novel about a very naive traveler who is trying to find the best place in the world. And Candide goes on many adventures with his trusted companion, and they get into a lot of difficulties, which some of them they don't even realize they're difficulties. And it's kind of a funny satire of the French society and things that were wrong in the French government. Another writer was a man named Jonathan Swift, and he wrote his famous piece was called Gulliver's Travels, which was similar in that it was the main character finds himself in different places in the world where they're very unique. In one case, he is Gulliver is much larger than the subjects of the place where he has landed. The Lilliputians is what they're called, and they are a bloodthirsty bunch of very human characters. And so Gulliver, Jonathan Swift tries to bring out the faults in human nature through the adventures of Gulliver. And another time, Gulliver lands in a place where he is the little one in a society full of giants. And it's just to point out the idiosyncrasies of human nature and of governments and all kinds of things. The third author is Montanescu, and he wrote a novel called Persian Letters, which also mocked French society. The ideas of these books spread while people were reading them, but there were also a lot of pamphlets that were printed, which were much cheaper than a book, and helped to spread the ideas of the Enlightenment. And also, ideas were spread through something called salons, which were basically gatherings that were hosted by famous, wealthy French women who wanted to help disseminate some of the ideas of the Enlightenment. Oh, well, this was the slide that I was going to talk about the three main authors of the Enlightenment period. So, Candide by Voltaire. There is also the Jonathan Swift, which is not one of these that's pictured here, and Montanescu, also not pictured. Oh, he's here, second to the last. The arts also evolved along the Enlightenment ideas. In the age of Louis XIV, courtly art and architecture were very grand and opulent, and they only reflected like lives of the saints or a Roman or Greek mythology or glorious battles. And this was called the Baroque style. It's more heavy, darker, brighter colors, the kind of thing that was used to decorate the Palace of Versailles. So in the court of Louis XV, Louis XIV's predecessor, he wanted a much less formal style. So a new style started to develop called the Rococo style, which is lighter, more fanciful and fun, and the artists started to move away from the heavy, dark splendor kind of the Baroque period, and this style was really criticized by the philosophers as being superficial. Well, this Rococo style was criticized by the philosophers for being superficial, fluffy, not dealing with anything serious. But this is what the nobility and the upper classes wanted, so it became very popular. As like art, music also began to develop, and there was a new style called the classical style, which started to emerge. And some of the main classical musicians, well, beginning with, the first one was Johann Sebastian Bach. He was known for creating religious works for the organ and choirs. And his contemporary was Georg Friedrich Handel, who was also German, but ended up living most of his life in England, serving in the court of George I, who was also a German, but was invited to become King of England after the Stuarts died out. So Handel wrote a piece for George I called The Messiah, and it was inspired by scripture, and he did it in a very, very short amount of time, but it is a genius piece. So Handel is by far my favorite classical composer. Another example of a classical composer would be Franz Joseph Haydn, who also composed classical music, but his works are probably the most classical of classical. He developed the string quartet and the symphony. And then finally, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who created operas and symphonies and religious music that defined the new styles of composition. So these four composers become the backbone of the classical style. So coming full circle again, literature began to develop new forms, and readers, especially in the middle class, liked stories about their own times told in straightforward language. So there were a lot of new novels that were created that were fiction, and one example of this would be Robinson Crusoe, which was written by Daniel Defoe. It's an exciting tale about a shipwrecked man who is washed ashore on a tropical island. And it's actually based on a true story. So it's not completely a novel, but it's written for entertainment purposes. And so it's considered to be one of the first and earliest novels. Well, of course, the nobility and the kings and queens of Europe are not exempt from the Enlightenment movement. Absolute monarchs wanted to accept Enlightenment ideas as well, but they had a dilemma because none of them wanted to give up the absolute power that they had over their kingdoms. So they decided that a compromise could be that they would use that absolute power to try to create the best good for their society. And it only works so far because people fundamentally long for freedom, from freedom from absolute control over their lives. So monarchs began to try to apply the ideas of the Enlightenment to their governments. And there are three monarchs that I want to talk about. This, by the way, this picture is a picture of the King of Sweden, but the one that we are going to talk about is Joseph II, who is from Austria, which I couldn't find a picture of, so we're going to have to deal with this picture. All right, but the three rulers are Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Joseph II, who is not pictured here. This guy is just a fill-in. So, the ideas of the philosophers began to contribute to these rulers and the reforms that they wanted to create. Frederick the Great of Prussia began to reduce the use of torture in his dealings with the population. He also began to allow freedom of the press, and he also wanted to have a toleration of religious differences. During his reign, more Jews immigrated to Germany than at any other time in German history. And this is what sets it up for the amount of Jews that will be found there during the end of World War I and II, and the rise of Hitler. So it was due to Frederick the Great's benevolent and tolerant dealing with other religions that enabled the Jews to find a place in Germany. Catherine the Great of Russia also began to abolish torture. She also established religious toleration to some extent, and she also began to grant nobles more rights and freedoms. This actually did not do anything for the serfs that were under the nobles' rules, but she did issue things that criticized the institution of serfdom in Russia. She knew that it was holding back Russia, but it was difficult for her to get rid of it because of the nobles who insisted that it was essential to their well-being. So it was kind of a similar dilemma to that of the American South and slavery. The third, who was Joseph II of Austria, was actually the son of Maria Theresa. And he, like his mother, wanted to do a really good job for his country. So he worked very hard to try to modernize Austria's government. He supported religious equality of Jews and Protestants, even though Austria is a Catholic country, and he ended censorship, and he also abolished serfdom. But in Austria, Joseph II's changes were a little bit too quick and without the consent of the nobles. And so when he died, when Joseph II died, all those changes were reverted back to the original format. So that was kind of sad. Most Europeans' lives were untouched by the Enlightenment and this new cultural movement that was going on, because the majority were still poor peasants who lived in rural villages. By the late 1700s, ideas about equality and social justice were just beginning to percolate into peasant villages, and these ideas began to sow the seeds of political upheaval that would happen in the 1800s. And this is where we get the problems with revolution.